Alright guys, BLM here, back with a new video. In this video I'll be talking about the Yakuza series once again. Now in the last video I did talk about Yakuza's 0, Kiwami, and Kiwami 2, and in this video I was actually going to try to talk about my experience playing the rest of the Kiryu saga, which obviously includes Yakuza's 3, 4, 5, and 6, but then when I started writing this video, it just ended up being way longer than I intended. So obviously I'm going to have to end up stretching the series out a bit. So in this video, I'll only be talking about Yakuza's 3 and 4. Now I did play the PS4 versions of all these games on the remastered collection, and this video will be mostly discussing the narratives of these games, as to be honest, gameplay wise, there's not that much that there's to talk about. I mean, it's a lot of the same from previous entries in the series, just with very minute differences. But that out of the way, let's jump right into it with Yakuza 3, which was not a great start to this block of games here. I mean, Yakuza 3 has to be my least favorite of the Yakuza games I've played so far. Now, there are a couple of new gameplay features here that don't really play a major role, but let's talk about them anyway. We do have chase battles, which only happen a few times, and it's kind of dumb, where you obviously just chase your enemies down and you have to tackle them until their stamina meter drops. And it is something that actually does appear in the future installments of the series as well. But every single time I play a chase battle here, it just feels so ridiculous to me. The other addition I'll talk about here are the revelations, which are throughout the world and use the first person mode to witness incidents that teach you these new heat actions, which later get added to Kiryu's personal blog for some reason. I don't know why that was the thing that needed to happen. These are cool, though I never really bothered with them beyond the one that they force you to do within the course of the story. Another new thing about this game is the new location in Ryukyu, being the location of Kiryu's orphanage, and it does feel radically different from the other locations within the series up to this point, where really most of the games have taken place in these really big cities with a whole bunch of neon lights and massive crowds. That really isn't the case with Ryukyu here. I mean, it is a relatively small city on a tropical island, obviously radically different from the rumbling streets of Kamurocho. Though realistically, I mean, obviously these locations just function the same. Same type of shops are within these areas. Level design's obviously slightly different and aesthetics are different, but it's like for the most part they serve the exact same purpose of being these relatively small open worlds for you to explore. But now for the narrative, which does start in medias res with a long series of cutscenes that start with us seeing Kiryu's current daily life, with him taking care of the kids at the Morning Glory orphanage, only for him to get news that day that Daigo has been shot, and that the person that shot him looks just like Kiryu's adopted father that died all the way back in Yakuza 1, which is this like big plot twist that does add some intrigue, though the way that it gets resolved is just kind of underwhelming. But this does lead up to Chapter 1, where we do go back 2 years to the events of the epilogue of Yakuza 2, with this scene revealing that Sayama, Kiryu's love interest from the previous game, is moving to America for her job. And this is just kind of dumb, where it really is just such a waste of her character. I mean, she is a character that I liked. I liked her relationship with Kiryu back in Yakuza 2, but for them to just throw her character away here was underwhelming. But also, I just don't get why she's never brought up again. Like, why completely throw her away? Like, I get, like, okay, you don't want her in the events of Yakuza 3, that's fine. But to not even have her be brought up in, like, Yakuza's 4, 5, and 6 just feels bizarre to me. But we do spend some time in Kamurocho, mainly with trying to set up Daigo for being the leader of the Tojo clan, with getting Majima to agree to help him out, before leaving for Okinawa, obviously the location of his orphanage. And there we jump forward a few months and we get a good chunk of the game that focuses around Kiryu running the orphanage. And at first, I was actually enjoying this section. It did feel like a good amount of downtime that allowed you to get to know the kids at the orphanage, and you got to help them out with all of their minute issues. And again, at first, I enjoyed that. But it just went on and on and on. And it's like, oh my god. It's like really the pacing of this game is its biggest issue. I do feel like this game would have been so much better if it had been cut, I don't know, like by a third. I mean, like, it's so strange because it's like, this is actually probably the shortest Yakuza game in the series. I mean, I guess it's like probably up for debate with like Yakuza 1, but it's a relatively short game. But it still feels like it goes on for way too long. But eventually we do get caught up with the prologue, where we get a few chapters of actual important content for the plot, before going back to the orphanage and doing the same thing again. Again, just helping these kids out with their issues. And it really, again, it just harms the pacing, it harms the focus of the narrative, where, again, none of this is actually necessary to progress the main narrative of the game. I mean, it would have been, again, a lot better if this was side content. But as part of the main story, portions really do taint my outlook on this game as a whole. But during this section, we do meet Rakia? I don't know how you pronounce his name, but he is a good sidekick character for Kiryu. Though I was disappointed that he does end up dying later in the narrative, and through that, obviously, this ends up being his only appearance. But through this section, we do also learn that the Tojo clan are trying to buy the land where Kiryu's orphanage is located, in order for them to build a resort and also a U.S. military base. And when Kiryu turns down the offer to sell his land, obviously Daigo promises not to go through with the acquisition as long as Kiryu is there. And this obviously sets up the modern day, where Daigo has been shot by the man looking just like Kiryu's adopted father after having refused to continue with the deal. But after this, we do finally return to Kamurocho, and these next few chapters were pretty strong. But in many ways, this very much felt like how the previous games would begin, except that this was chapter 5. Which again, for me, I just don't think the pacing of this game was its strong suit. But for the next few chapters, we do encounter some of the higher-ups at the Tojo clan, including some encounters with the remnants of the Nishikiyama family, which leads to this ridiculous chase sequence within a hotel where you have to break into rooms to find your target, and that was just kind of dumb. We do eventually meet up with Majima and catch up with him, and to be honest, his storyline here doesn't feel that different from what it was in Yakuza 2. But we do end up fighting him again in the Coliseum. We eventually get into conflict with the Snake Flower Triad, during which we get rescued by the Kazuma lookalike, who reveals that he's actually Kazuma's younger brother, Joji, which is just kind of dumb and pointless. In many ways, I felt like this plot point was so unnecessary. Again, while it was cool that it set up this mystery right from the offset of who is this guy? Why does he look just like Kazuma? Has Kazuma faked his death? Obviously, those are cool things, but it leads to just kind of an underwhelming outcome here, where he's really just added there just to add some suspense. And really, his involvement in the story doesn't really amount to that much. Now, another issue I have is something that, to be fair, the Yakuza series does do a lot, but this is the most blatant example I've seen from the first 4 games that we've talked about, where a lot of the Yakuza series just has these massive exposition dumps on you, and there's literally a conversation with the defense minister in this game, where the entire point of this conversation is for them to just dump pretty much every single plot point on you, for them to pretty much detail literally everything that has happened within the narrative. And it's so funny to me that you literally sit there for 15-20 minutes while the defense minister pretty much just reveals the entire plot. But through this, we do learn that Joji worked for the CIA and is now hunting down a rogue unit called Black Monday, who run an arms trafficking operation. And we learned that the point of the bill to build the U.S. military base was to draw them out. This feels very convoluted, but to be fair, we just came from Yakuza 2, which had one of the most convoluted endings to any game I've ever played. So, what else do you expect? But after this, we do return to the orphanage once again, where we get a lot of monotonous tasks once again. But eventually the plot does continue, where Mine is a high-ranking Tojo clan member, and he destroys the orphanage, drawing Kiryu out once again, and we get a lot of fight sequences from this point till the end, as you would expect from the ending of any Yakuza game. But at the end of chapter 11, we do have Rakia, I can't pronounce his name, sacrificing himself, and obviously that's depressing, though I do think he has a good farewell scene. But at the end of the day, I do wish that they kept him around. I do feel like he could have had some interesting storylines with Kiryu moving forward, though at the same time with Yakuza's 4 and 5 not really focusing solely on Kiryu, I guess he wouldn't really have that much of a role in those games anyway. But then we get to the final chapter, where we end up following Mine to the hospital where Daigo is being treated, and Mine wants to kill him to take over the Tojo clan. And once we get there, we do have to fight a ton of clan members, and Also, a lot of CIA agents, including their leader, Andre Richardson, who speaks in broken English, which was just so funny to me. But we get to the roof where we have the final fight in the game with Mine, and this was pretty anticlimactic, especially in comparison to the previous games in the series. Though, to be fair, I mean, I complained about those games, talking about how ridiculous it was that the game would make you think that this was the final fight multiple times within those games, Yakuza 2 in particular. But I think coming from those games, I was expecting a similar thing within Yakuza 3, but it just didn't happen. But here we do finally get Mine's backstory, and the game does try to redeem him at the end here with him sacrificing himself to take Richardson down. But for me, I did find Mine to be a pretty underwhelming antagonist in the grand scheme of things. And I mean, if we're talking about Richardson, I mean, obviously he was a bad antagonist as well. But then we get to the epilogue, which I really just found dumb. I mean, we see Kiryu and Haruka preparing to leave for Kamurocho, only for Hamazaki, one of the Tojo clan members that Kiryu defeated earlier, stabbing Kiryu in the middle of a plaza, and he passes out. Again, ending the game very similar to how Yakuza 2 ended, with them trying to fake us out to think that Kiryu is dead, when obviously he isn't. Again, they rectify again in the post-credit scene, where we do see that Kiryu has survived. And again, at the time, I thought this was so pointless. I do think they rectify that through the course of Yakuza 4, obviously as they make use of this storyline. But as a piece of Yakuza 3, this just felt unnecessary. And overall, I mean, Yakuza 3 for me felt mostly like a pointless entry in the series. Narratively, it is pretty episodic with some massive pacing issues. I mean, if we're really thinking about it, I think the most important thing that happens over the course of this narrative, in terms of the grand narrative of the Kiryu saga, is probably that final scene with Hamazaki. Everything else is more so just background on the character of Kiryu and what he's been doing. None of that is actually necessary to the overall plot. Again, so much of this game just has massive pacing issues for me. Again, while like half the game is your typical Yakuza fare, the other half is doing meandering tasks for orphans. So I did not love my experience with Yakuza 3. It really came out of playing it pretty underwhelmed. But now let's talk about Yakuza 4, which I definitely enjoyed more so than the previous game. While I do still think it has some pacing issues, I just felt like its narrative was definitely a lot stronger. Again, there isn't much to talk about here gameplay-wise, as it is essentially more of Yakuza 3, with the exception of a pretty major change in the fact that we do play as 4 different characters in this game instead of just Kiryu, and with each of these characters comes a different fighting style that did remind me of the different styles from Yakuza 0, and the concept of the 4 different characters was worrying to me at first, but I do think it brings a breath of fresh air to the formula that had gotten pretty dry by the time of Yakuza 3. Yakuza 3 for the most part felt as if they were really struggling to tell any semblance of a story, especially a story that mattered, as so much of that game just feels like filler, while in Yakuza 4, with the amount of time needed to introduce these characters and these gameplay styles, it does feel a lot more consistent. Also, unlike Yakuza 3, the only open world in this game is Kamurocho, though the city itself is expanded here with the rooftops and the underground now explorable, though I will say that some of these new locations were kind of annoying to navigate around, but it's still a cool addition to add more to the city that we obviously know very well. Now let's talk about the narrative, which is broken down into 5 parts, the first one following Shun Akiyama, and while this was the longest of the parts, this might have also actually been my favorite of the bunch. I really liked Akiyama as a character. You start off with him running a money lending company, which you would assume would make him this really sketchy, schemy guy, but what I loved about his story is how they connected it to the original game, with the fact that he used to be homeless and he got his wealth from the money that dropped onto the city during the Jingu confrontation back in the original game, and now uses that money to help out others. I thought that was a really great character background for him. Now, with his story being the first one in the game, we do also get introduced to a lot of new characters like Arai and Kido, who are really important to the story moving forward. But I'll be honest that during the early portions of this game, I didn't fully grasp what was going on when it pertains to their involvement in the story and how they factored into the overall narrative. I did find it funny that by the end of chapter 1, we do get Akiyama getting framed for a murder, which, I mean, doesn't happen to every character within this series. Though by the beginning of the next chapter, he's already released, which kind of made that plot point pointless, but whatever. This does lead to Akiyama meeting Lily, a mysterious woman who wants a loan, and Akiyama ends up making a deal with her that he would give it to her if she passed his test. And for me, this was the most interesting storyline during the Akiyama part here. With, again, obviously there being the mystery of why does she need this money, plus also Akiyama having a fondness for her. That is later explained as her resembling his ex-girlfriend, which was kind of a pointless connection. Like, I don't know why that specific plot point needed to be there, but whatever. And while I didn't love the Cabaret Club mini game, I did like seeing how it bonded these two characters. And eventually she does obviously pass the test, and Akiyama allows her to keep the money. Now, I will say that I do think Chapter 4 of this part did go on for a bit too long. It did start to drag at a point, but I still did enjoy it enough, and I liked how this part ended with us having a fight against the Majima family, only for Majima himself to appear at the end and reveal that he's hunting down Lily not to kill her, but to protect her. And he reveals that he's been doing so to make up for how he failed her 25 years ago. And that's when we get a flashback and move on to part 2, which revolves around Taiga Seijima, who is the older brother of Lily, whose real name is Yasuko Seijima, and he's also the sworn brother to Majima. To which we do see Majima here pre-Yakuza 0, which was interesting. Though, to be fair, this obviously came out before Yakuza 0, so obviously 0 was made with this in mind. We do see the backstory to Seijima here, with him being tasked by the Tojo to assassinate the chairman of the Seiwa clan, a clan that's in a turf war with the Tojos, and one that Akiyama interacted with in the previous part. And on the day of the assassination, Majima doesn't show up, and Seijima goes in by himself, and while he does end up killing most of the people there, he does fail to kill the chairman, and ends up getting caught and given the death penalty. And I really did love this backstory for him. Again, another really tragic one, but one that did make him a likable figure moving forward. And we do move forward 25 years where he is still awaiting his execution, and he gets transferred to a new prison. And when doing so, he ends up befriending Hamazaki, the guy that stabbed Kiryu in the epilogue of Yakuza 3, which was a really bizarre callback for me. Like, I was not expecting that, as again, within the course of Yakuza 3, it just felt so dumb that this was a thing that even happened. But for them to actually utilize that storyline made that scene matter a bit more. And I do love the callback here, though I do question what they end up doing with the character of Hamazaki moving forward. But together they attempt a prison break, and the gameplay of this section was kind of annoying. I mean, gameplay-wise, Seijima's section here was probably my least favorite, despite it being fine narratively. I just didn't love the walking around and talking to everyone in the yard so you can gather the supplies needed to make the tools, and it really was just tedious to me. But they eventually make their escape, though Hamazaki gets shot on the way out, leaving Seijima to go on his own after being told by Hamazaki to seek out Kiryu, presumably due to what Kiryu told him at the end of Yakuza 3. And I do really love a lot of this from a narrative standpoint. Though, again, I don't love that Hamazaki doesn't just end up being dead after this. I feel like that was the correct call to make, for him to survive and then die again later. For him to actually die off screen as well. It just felt like a bizarre choice in my opinion, and I would have just preferred it if he just died here. And they just found another way for Kiryu to be called back to action. But after this, Seijima washes up ashore on Morning Glory Beach, conveniently, where he is found by Haruka and taken in by Kiryu. Again, how convenient. But for some reason, Seijima lies to Kiryu, which I just found really dumb, as he really has no reason to lie here, especially considering he finds out relatively early on that the guy that saved him here is Kiryu, the guy he is looking for. So, like, why are you lying to this guy that you've been told to trust? But whatever. This does lead to a really strange fight where we play as Seijima and we have to fight Kiryu, which, again, fighting the main protagonist of the series, a character that you've grown to love over the last few games, and have to fight him using a new character that you haven't gotten to know that well so far, was kind of weird. And really, at the end of the day, this really amounts to nothing, as Seijima just ends up being given the money anyway to go to Kamurocho. And with Seijima's arrival in Kamurocho, we do end up in a similar position to where we come into with most Yakuza games, with us returning to Kamurocho after having been gone for a while and having to figure out what's happened since he's been gone. And here he does go on a search for the people that were in his life previously, from his former boss to Majima. And he does eventually find the florist who resides in Purgatory, which to enter, you need to go through the underground, which I remembered from my time playing Judgment. It's just so bizarre to me playing a game that came out 7 years before that one. And the level design still pretty much being exactly the same. But whatever, I mean, once we get to Purgatory, we have the fight in the Underground Coliseum, because this is a Yakuza game, and when do you not fight in the Underground Coliseum? But this ends up being a test from the florist, where Seijima now refuses to kill again, which is a nice character moment for him. But after this, we do have Seijima heading out to confront Majima, and we end up fighting him for no real reason, but whatever, we do get the truth from Majima about what happened 25 years ago, where he ends up being stopped by Shibata, a leader within the Tojo clan, who ends up gouging Majima's eye out, which, yeah, I guess it's cool they added the backstory to that, but I don't get why Shibata just didn't kill him at that point. It's like, you're already pulling his eye out. It's like, why not just kill him? But whatever, this reveal is essentially the end of the Seijima story, and that's when we get the story of Tanemura, who I found to be the blandest of the new characters here. I mean, I never really connected with him as a character, despite his storyline being so important to the overall narrative. And this section of the game really being the section that makes you figure out what's going on. So I did like how Tanemura was actually present during the Akiyama part of the game, so that was a cool little piece to connect those two storylines from very early on. But Tanemura's character kind of has the opposite approach to Akiyama's, where here Tanemura is obviously a cop, but he's a dirty cop, with him exploiting the position that he gets with his job pretty much right away within his storyline here. Though we do end up learning that he does use this dirty money that he gets to be a good guy to a degree, with him helping an organization that helps migrants. So right off the bat there are again a lot of ups and downs with his character. But after all of this, Tanemura receives a tip about Yasuko, who he has been looking for a while now, and he catches up to her, and we get more of his backstory, with his father being the detective in charge of the Seijima assassination attempt, and him having been murdered on his way to meet up with Yasuko. And I did like how they connected all of the storylines from the previous parts. Again, he connects with Akiyama's, he connects with Seijima's. But conveniently, before Tanemura is able to get any info from Yasuko, she gets kidnapped, leading to us having to rescue her from Shibata and Arai, and we start to figure out what is going on here, with Arai working for Katsurage, another survivor of the assassination attempt, and he betrays Shibata, killing him, though we do end up getting Yasuko back, where we learn that Katsurage is a major figure in this entire conspiracy, having used Yasuko to kill Shibata's men in exchange for getting Seijima out of jail. And with him demanding 10 million yen, we found out that's the reason why she got involved in Akiyama's storyline. Which again, I do love how they put all these narrative pieces together here. Later on, after meeting with Katsurage, we do learn more about the assassination, where Katsurage ordered the hit in order to eliminate all of his competition, and that Seijima wasn't really the one to kill all those men. It was actually Katsurage himself. And I mean, something I should mention here is I do actually like that this game does kind of get rid of the long pieces of exposition within the game that, again, I've grown accustomed to from the Yakuza series. I do feel like this game handles them in a bit better of a way, with this section in particular giving out these reveals in much smaller chunks instead of just like laying it all out on us at one time. We do also get the meetup between two of the newer main characters, with Tanemura returning Yasuko's money to Akiyama, which was the first time that it felt like all these pieces are truly coming together. But eventually we do find out more about what's actually happening, where we find out that Tanemura's father's killer was his former partner, Sugiuchi. We do have this climatic battle between the two, and afterwards he ends up revealing pretty much everything, that the guns that were provided to Seijima were not actually lethal, and that Katsurage himself killed them afterwards, which seems really convenient to make Seijima innocent, but whatever. Sugiuchi, I can't pronounce his name, ends up getting caught by his superior, Munakata, who ends up being the main antagonist of the game, and he had been blackmailing him and Katsuragi into doing what he wants to cover everything up, including the murder of Tanemura's father. And the reason why the current events are occurring is to give them the ability to escape Munakata's control. Again, this is overly complicated, but I mean, what do you expect from the Yakuza series at this point? After revealing this information, Sugiyuchi, I can't pronounce his name, is assassinated, and we move on to part 4, where we're finally back with the series' main protagonist, Kiru. Which is obviously cool, but I will say that I do feel like the underwhelming part of this game's narrative is that Kiru very much feels like an afterthought in this game. While the previous Yakuza games obviously focus pretty much solely around him, with the exception of 0. Yakuza 6 obviously focuses solely around him. Yakuza 5, despite having multiple characters again, like, it does feel like a story based around Kiru. This game just doesn't feel that way. It does feel like these new characters in Tanimura, Akiyama, and Seijima are just so much more important to the grand narrative than Kiru is, where it feels like Kiru is just being shoehorned in there because he's Kiru. He's the star of the series. But his storyline does start off with Hamazaki now washing ashore again, so convenient. And I did like how they connected this to the final scene of Yakuza 3, with Haruka struggling to forgive him and Kiru still allowing Hamazaki to stay. But through Hamazaki and him having stolen records from the prison before they escaped, we do now have the proof of Munakata's wrongdoings, and while he is hesitant at first, Kiru does end up helping Hamazaki, and conveniently, while doing so, they end up encountering Yasuko, who's arguing with police officers after they refuse to help her see her brother, who she still thinks is in prison. So these three get together, only to be ambushed by Saito, the guard captain of the prison, and this leads to Hamazaki's death. And again, for me, it just felt like a waste to have this reveal that Hamazaki was alive just to kill him off again within the same chapter. But Kiru and Yasuko end up escaping back to Kamurocho, where we see Majima get arrested because he refused to participate in the deal between Munakata and Daigo. And I really don't get what this game was doing with Daigo, but I guess we'll talk about that later. But they end up agreeing to let Munakata take over the Tojo clan for some reason. But then we find out that Yasuko has actually disappeared again, and we have to track her down, leading to us finding her with Akiyama and Tanimura, who we do end up having a boss battle with, which again is bizarre, now playing as Kiru, fighting two of the characters that we just spent a good chunk of the game playing as earlier in the game. But after this, we do find out that now Seijima has been taken hostage, because why not? And that Akiyama's money has been stolen due to Kido betraying him. And that leads to the penultimate chapter of the game, with Kiru confronting Katsuragi. And we do get a long fighting sequence, but eventually we do catch up with him and Kido, only to witness Kido betraying Katsuragi and revealing that he has been working with Arai, only for Arai to betray Kido and shoot him as well. Because again, why not convolute the plot even further? But now Katsuragi reveals that he's wearing a bulletproof vest, because again, why not? But he attempts to kill Taiga, only for Yasuko to take the bullet instead, and she proceeds to shoot Katsuragi in the head before dying herself, which again is just ridiculous. Obviously, her death does play a major role in the story and serves as a turning point here, where it does lead us to the finale, where the four characters are now all together and now work together to finally end this entire conspiracy. So they plot to use Akiyama's money to draw out their enemies, which is kind of a dumb plan, but again, who really cares about the realistic nature of this story at this point? But the entire story comes to a head at the top of Millennium Tower, where Daigo first appears with Kido on his side, because Kido needed another plot twist in this game of him actually having worked for Daigo the entire time. But we follow this up with the arrival of Arai and then Munakata, who comes with his own army of SWAT officers, and this is where the protagonists arrive on a helicopter, and we get the final showdowns here with each of the protagonists having a vendetta against their opponent, typical of a story like this, where we get 4 boss battles in a row, one with each character. First we have Akiyama against Arai, followed by Seijima versus Kido, both of which being pretty standard boss fights. Then we get to Kiru versus Daigo, and I just found this really dumb. And this is when we're going to talk about Daigo. I mean, what were they doing with him in this game? I mean, we literally spend the last 2 games in the series being really close allies with Daigo. Obviously, in Yakuza 2, we're the one to recruit him to become the chairman. In Yakuza 3, Daigo literally takes a bullet to defend Kiru's land. Yet in this game, Daigo appears to fight Kiru because he wants some money? And then we just randomly get this line of he wants to prove that he's worthy of being the leader of the Tojo clan for some reason. Again, this is dumb. Why are you fighting when there's this really massive conspiracy going on that's way more important than this really minuscule fight right now. Again, it really just feels like they were trying to find a way to add Kiryu to the story. It's like they needed someone for Kiryu to fight, and they were like, hey, wouldn't it be cool if we had Daigo and Kiryu fight? That would be awesome, right? And again, it just doesn't feel right for either of their characters to even be entertaining this fight in this situation, but whatever. We eventually get to the final boss, which surprisingly is with Tanemura. Not surprisingly in the sense that obviously this game seems to revolve around Tanemura and his storyline, but it is surprising the fact that obviously Kiryu isn't involved in the final boss battle. But Tanemura has the fight against Munakata and his men, and this is kind of a pain of a boss battle considering how many officers are guarding him, but to be honest, it is the most unique of the boss battles at the end of the game here, and we do obviously end up defeating him, avenging Tanemura's father's death. Instead of killing Munakata, we end up revealing to the public all of his crimes, using the info from the ledger, leading to Munakata killing himself instead, which felt pretty fitting. I mean, I think it would have been really strange to have these characters of like Akiyama, Seijima, Tanemura to just end up killing the main antagonist in cold blood, considering the arcs that they've been through. So I do think to have him kill himself, while maybe anticlimactic initially, like probably is the correct decision to make narratively. But then we get to the epilogue, which in Yakuza fashion has to have some ridiculousness to it. And here we have Akiyama's assistant having lost a whole bunch of weight due to barely eating, due to the stress of the recent events, which, I mean, that's something. But more importantly, we do have Tanemura convincing Date to return to the police to repair the corruption there. And we do get a final scene with a Tojo clan ceremony where Seijima is awarded his own family within the clan. And both these scenes I think are pretty strong. I think this is actually a pretty solid epilogue, especially in Yakuza standards. Though to be honest, I don't really love how they handle Seijima in Yakuza 5, but I mean, we'll talk about that later. But I do think this was another game that, like, to me, it felt like this could have been the final game in the series. I feel like this is another point where, like, if this had been the last game in the series, I would have been content with that. I feel like they were able to call back to Yakuza 1 enough to the point where this could have been conclusive, had a happy ending. Like, I feel like this was a fine point to stop if they wanted to, but obviously we still got 2 more games of Kiryu. But obviously this video is already long enough, so we will be talking about Yakuza's 5 and 6 in a future video. Overall, I mean, like, I really liked Yakuza 4. I thought it was a pretty solid entry in the series. Again, Yakuza 3, pretty mediocre in my eyes, but I do think Yakuza 4 is probably one of my favorites out of the ones I've played so far. It really felt like a breath of fresh air, despite not really changing that much, but through the addition of multiple characters and a much more complex narrative, though one that doesn't really drag for me, unlike something like a Yakuza 0 or a Yakuza 2. I do think Yakuza 4 does stand out to me as one of the better entries in the series. But those are my thoughts on Yakuza's 3 and 4. As I said, 5 and 6 are next. They're going to be a future video. Also, I would obviously like to do a series ranking down the road. What I'm actually currently thinking I'm going to do is I'm probably just going to leave it to just the Kiryu saga, as I just feel like it's just weird to add the spin-offs in there. And also I feel like a Dragon feels like such a radically different game to where it doesn't really feel fair to compare all these games together, especially when Yakuza 0 through 6 are so similar. So stay tuned for that. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.